and we've given ourselves a 15-minute break, like we only have to talk for 45 minutes at the most. So, all right. I think we're live. Yes. Okay, so welcome everybody who's watching to Shakespeare on Stage. We're talking about King John tonight, and I have Kathleen Ryman and Suki Waldenberger with me. And so we're gonna have some fun, hopefully, talking about this obscure play that nobody's read or heard of. So it should be interesting. So just to do a recap, I wanted to say, and by way of introduction, that I'm very familiar with Robin Hood, the Disney version, and the King John from that version, and that was my only experience with King John. So it was interesting seeing this, but I was happy to know that I'm not the only one who's never read this play before. So it was an interesting experience learning a little bit about history, although maybe Suki, you can tell us how accurate it is as far as that goes. I don't know, Kathleen, with your research too. But it was an interesting play about King John and King Richard's bastard son, and Arthur, who was King John's nephew, and this struggle for power. King of France is in there trying to grab some power. It was very much a who's going to own what or control what going on in the play.
So it's very focused on power plays, much like, if you think about it, Macbeth, Hamlet, and a lot of his historical plays, which are focused on the hierarchy of power and who is going to control the country. Interesting.
Well, you know, you got to remember he's writing for the current monarch. Yes. Always. So, and you know, he knows which side of the bread his which side his bread is buttered. That's how those player companies worked, as they had to have a powerful patron. And I can't remember when this play was written. If he was part of if he was part of the monarch's special troop at this point or not. But regardless, you make sure that you butter up the king or queen, whoever's in charge. So that's always the case in those histories. It's always about that struggle for power and legitimate power. Who has legitimate power? Especially because Elizabeth wasn't legitimate in many people's eyes.
That's interesting. So Kathleen, is that what you were talking about? Did she freeze again?
Yeah, kind of. All the way through Shakespeare's works, he explores the right of the monarch to do and act against other countries and also against his people. It's looking at the divine right of kings, and it really started with, I think it was Henry VIII. Suki, you'll have, maybe help me remember. And Henry VIII legitimizing his divorces.
Right, exactly. Because Elizabeth,
Shakespeare uses it on all of his plays.
Yeah, Elizabeth was the daughter of his second wife, and his first wife was still alive. Catherine was still alive. And so, you know, to many people, that made her a bastard. And in fact, she was treated like a bastard for a while, because then he got his third wife and had a son. And so, you know, he didn't need his daughters anymore. But then, you know, Edward, I think it was, Edward VI, I think, died. And you know, the power fell to his daughters, first Mary and then Elizabeth, but she spent her whole life trying to make sure that she was seen as the legitimate heir of her father.
Right. Right.
So that's interesting that you say that, Suki, because I didn't make that connection. And I watched Stratford had a little video with the guy who played the King John, and the guy who played the bastard Richard, whatever name you want to call. He had many names in the play, and they were saying that he had 20% or more of the lines in the play, where the king actually only had a handful. And so they were kind of talking about that, but that makes sense if he's kind of and that character has more is more honorable, I guess I want to say. He's more likable than the actor king. So it makes sense if Shakespeare's writing for Elizabeth, it makes sense he would make that character more likable, more, and give him more lines. It makes him seem more important. Does that true?
Well, like I said, I'm not sure when this play was written, but I think the histories came later. This is just it's not a very popular play, at least not currently. It doesn't get shown very much. It doesn't get produced very much. I ended up seeing it because the Utah Shakespeare Festival decided to do all the histories in chronological order. And of course, this is the first. So.
Right, because John's son was Henry III, which I did do some research and figure that out.
Okay.
So then there's what are the other ones, Suki, in order?
Henry the Fourth.
I don't know them in order.
But you know, Kathleen, this is what you studied, right?
Well, not necessarily. No, my thing is my focus was on the divine right of kings and how Shakespeare put that through all of his histories in order to help justify the reigning monarch. So I'm not familiar with the timeline as far as the plays and the history.
But certainly he wants to legitimize the ancestors of the Tudor line.
Absolutely.
Because that's how he reinforces the claim, whether it's Elizabeth or James. I mean, there was a lot of angst around the inheriting the throne between Henry and then his shenanigans with his wives and 3 kids from 3 different mothers, and it's very contemporary in some ways. But it really did put strain on the idea of how the kingship is passed along the bloodline.
Right. One of the things that I did want to bring up is that with the divine right of kings, which came from the medieval idea of the great chain of being, just talking about, God at the top, the angels, then humans, and then animals, then plants, and then minerals. Then from that, even closer, it is the divine right of kings. And the first aspect of that is that the king's power comes from God, not from the people, they didn't even have parliament then, but it comes from God. And because of that, he's God's anointed, or she, and they can pretty much do whatever they want. Although I don't know about John, but like in Henry V, he explores the idea of, is the king going to be held accountable for doing things that he's not supposed to do? I'm not familiar with John. Second, the king has the final say in all political and social decisions, and anyone else exercising political power does so at the king's behest. And then third, kings must never actively resist their sovereign. So these are things that are going to help legitimize either James or Elizabeth when this play came out, because they are the quote unquote divinely chosen sovereign. And in a lot of ways, these plays act as propaganda.
Yes, absolutely. And that's how you curry favor and then, get money for your next production.
You gotta pay the players. If I remember
That's right.
correctly, from Restoration Theater, the playwright got every third night income. So the first 2 nights went to the theater, and the third night, I have to look it up, but the playwright didn't get all the money coming in. He only got a certain amount. So if a play was canceled before the third night, they made no money. So it was important that the play be popular, but also popular with the sovereigns so that it would continue.
Well, I know Shakespeare was a part owner of his company, so yeah, he was one of the managers who would presumably be paid first.
Yeah, he actually
So
made.
so he had his hands in both ways.
That was one of the first things that we learned in my class, is that he's actually made a living from a pretty good living from writing plays, and one of the few people who actually did that. So there's an interesting scene in the play talking about that, the idea of who has the right to rule, where they've besieged a city, and the citizens in the city, Suki, maybe you remember this in the version you watched, are saying, the King John is saying, let me in because I'm your king. And then the King of France is saying, no, let me in because I represent Arthur, who should be your king. And the people of the city are saying, we'll let the king in, but you have to prove who's really the king. And so they were putting it on the two kings to prove which one really had the right to be king. That was an interesting scene in that play. And what happened was the two kings decided to just turn against the city together. Instead of really proving who was right to be king, they were just going to destroy the city. So that was interesting.
Well, and that's all the case, right? When the little people get in the way of the power machinations of the powerful, right? Of the people who are in charge.
Yeah, I just thought it was so witty, and it was like the last one we talked about a tragedy last week too, but there was funny moments in the play. So in the Stratford version, people were laughing out loud. I mean, it was really funny. They were playing laughs for laughs a lot at the beginning. And it was really fun. It was really kind of fun to see that here we have this kind of play where not everybody dies in this one. So I guess it's a history play. It's not really a tragedy, but it wasn't like people die. It wasn't like a love story. It was just like all these bad things happen. People go to war. Half the English troops drowned in some tidal wave or something. And everybody's just bloodshed for nothing in the end.
Well, Shakespeare knows his audience, and he knows that, people, especially the groundlings, are looking for a laugh, right? Mm-hmm. The apprentices that are scampering off from work and taking the afternoon off, they're looking for the clowns and the scatological and the sexual innuendos, and you find that no matter where you are. In fact, I started reading some Shakespeare in high school, like a lot of students do. Didn't like it, like a lot of students don't. But for some reason, I picked up Hamlet on my own. It wasn't an assignment. And there were really good footnotes. And of course, this, but get to the part where Hamlet's talking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and they start making these dirty jokes. You know, three college friends talking about not being at Fortune's cap and not being at her feet, but being in, you know, a private in Fortune's privates. And, you know, high school me went, oh, there's jokes in Shakespeare? Who knew? Right. But that's what brought people into the theater. Right. When playing at the courts, the you know, royal court loves to hear all about the kings and the king's kings and the lineage, but you gotta keep the cheap seats happy too.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and I think Kathleen, wasn't it you last time you talked about the play from last week could be 6 hours long? And so if people
Yeah.
are on their feet for that long of time, you don't want them bored. Because I imagine
if you run Hamlet completely uncut, with all of the dancing and everything that goes on in it, it runs anywhere from 5.5 to 6 hours long.
So
Yikes.
that was something that was interesting in this version is what I've been doing for the plays that I'm not familiar with is I pull up the text from folder and then I watch the play at the same time and kind of read along. So I see where they're skipping lines, whether on purpose or accidentally, probably on purpose because they're professionals, but I see where that's happening, but it kind of helps me to see. But then there were all these parts where they would come in and sing in Latin and I'm like, that's not in the script. Where did this come from? I have no idea what they're saying. You know, so that was interesting. So I didn't realize Hamlet had that too. So was that actually in the script or is that something that these companies just kind of add in for?
It really depends. I can tell you because I spent 15 years acting in plays that every play is different. Every time you do it, there's something just a little bit different, whether it's intentional or not. So, and as you pointed out last week, what we have are things that were written down from actors' recollections. They were never meant to be, you know, put in a folio. So there are, in some cases, multiple versions. Now we can run Shakespeare through plagiarism software, and they have, and they've noticed places where they can see where he's taken stuff from earlier plays and integrated it into his own. That was very common then. They would rehash things and redo things and put things together. I don't think they had the same idea of plagiarism that we do now.
Well, especially because he wasn't actually writing it down. You know,
Right.
That's part of what our whole plagiarism is that you're writing something down and once you write it, it's yours. And so they didn't really have that.
No, it was much more fluid. And you took from whatever sources you needed and used it as you needed it. Yeah, he wasn't writing for posterity, right? He was writing because that's was his job. He was an actor, a producer, and that's what he wanted to do. And yeah, we don't have, you know, like Shakespeare's notes on his plays because that's not how they were produced. That's not how they were intended to be. They need to be watched and listened, not read, even though it's a joy to read them. But that's not what they were intended to do. And so, yeah, there were a lot of conventions of Elizabethan theater, of dancing, and it was not very, it was very stylized. So I saw just recently a version of Measure for Measure that was done by the Globe in London. And they prided themselves on can't remember exactly what their phrase is, but authenticity. They were doing the plays like Shakespeare would have done the plays. And so there was like dancing in between some of the scenes. And halfway through the play, I realized that I think this is correct, that all of the female actors or female parts were being played by men.
Interesting.
But spectacular Elizabethan drag. I kept looking them up going, wait a minute, why is what's the I can't remember the main character's name in Measure for Measure now, but Isabella. Why is Isabella being played by an actor named David? I guess there could be a female actress named David, but holy cow. So yes, I have seen that in other plays where just completely out of the blue, the company comes in kicking and dancing and twirling as they're changing scenery and that sort of thing. And that does make the plays longer.
Well, and that's one of the things that was interesting about the filmed version was that the scenes just ran into each other. So there wasn't, in many cases, there wasn't really a break between the scene. The actors would walk out and the new ones would walk in, and it was seamless. So I was flipping to the next scene as the lines were being said because it didn't stop.
Right.
So that was interesting to see. So one of the things that the actors were talking about when they were talking about this particular version is that it's every time they performed it, it was different, but got captured on film. And so they were kind of talking just a little bit about how capturing it on film takes away some of that aspect, because if you go to see the play live, you never know what's going to happen. It could be different night to night, but the filmed version then is always the same. So they have to capture it kind of differently for film, which was interesting.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
at that point, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's just the difference between live theater, right, and a filmed performance. And just before this, I was reading an article about Broadway is closed until 2021. They've decided that they're not going to, it's just not safe to have live theater. And thank God we have these streams, and July 3rd is Hamilton on Disney Plus. I just heard woohoo from my husband on the others. And that's fantastic, because who could go to Broadway to see Hamilton and who could afford those tickets, right? But it's not live theater. Yeah. And you lose something in the translation, even though we do gain things as well.
Yeah, it's really funny because I haven't had much experience to go to live theater, but when I was in college, I took a theater class, and part of that class, of course, was going to performances. So all semester, and I got my husband to go along. We had so much fun. But now, if I said Hamilton's going to be on July 3rd, my husband would be like, what are you talking about? So Suki, I think you're very blessed that you get someone who can watch those things with you and be excited.
There's a tremendous amount of energy in a live performance that I don't think there is in a film performance. As an actor, I can tell you that you feed off of the audience, so it's a totally different feeling.
Yeah. So, and there was a live audience. So it was a play that they did live, but they had a film director as well as their regular director. So it had to have been different. I don't know if they edited it afterward but at one point, when the bastard comes back with somebody's head, he gives it the head to somebody in the audience. The guy in the audience was like, okay, thank you. And it was great. It was a great moment. So I
haven't seen this version of John, but I did go back after and watch the version that you put up of Hamlet. And I have to tell you, I've seen a lot of Hamlets that I'm going to use that because it was phenomenal. And maybe that's because I've seen Hamlet so much and I'm so familiar with it, but I love the interpretations that the actors did, their facial expressions, their tonality. It was amazing. So I felt that that came through, even though it was recorded, that play feeling came through so well. And even though the costuming was more contemporary, it just really was riveting for me. I loved it. So thank you for sharing that one.
Yeah.
Now I'll have to go back and watch John.
Yeah, before Thursday, because it expires on Thursday. So yeah, although there's YouTube links that you can find too. So I don't know, maybe they're just expiring them off of their website. I haven't tested it to see. Have you, Suki, to see if it actually expires?
I don't know. I mean, it certainly does on their website because they have that rotating list. But yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why they're doing this, though, is what we're talking about is this sort of live. Obviously, it's not live, but it's a limited engagement, right? You have to see it in that period. And I think Stratford is actually doing a watch party for each play when it first premieres, the night it first premieres, maybe, to try to recreate that sort of sense of energy and watching together. I mean, when I teach a film class, I insist that we watch the films together. Even though it's a film, it's not a play, but still it's different than watching it at home by yourself or on your computer or on your phone or whatever. So that may be why they're, limiting their access, is to create that sense. Oh, I've got to go back. I got to go back and see one now.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is the plays that they've chosen. And Suki, I know you've mentioned before that they had a specific reason somewhere that you found that they chose these plays. But I was telling Kathleen before we went live that I took Shakespeare as an undergrad and that I took it again, a graduate class last semester, and we studied basically the same plays. So I was looking through my old papers and I had papers on The Tempest from when I was 20 and papers that I wrote last semester on The Tempest. It was really interesting, but I felt like, well, maybe I should have, as a graduate student, studied some of these other plays that are not as popular. I don't know. It gives a whole different kind of perspective on things, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the plays that aren't played as often, that aren't produced as often, are often just more difficult language-wise, or aren't the histories in general are kind of harder to be they're less accessible unless you have the historical background, right? When I saw King John at the Utah Shakespeare Festival up in Cedar City, I went to the pre-play talk, and it was by one of the founders of that festival, who said, just relax and listen. Don't get hung up on the language. Don't get hung up on trying to figure out what's going on, and you'll get it. And I did. I really enjoyed the production that I saw, and it made sense to me. I mean, I wasn't lost at any time during the play, even though I wasn't hugely familiar with the circumstances, the history that was behind it. But I do think there's some plays that are just more harder. They're just rougher. They're not as neat and tidy. And so it takes more work.
I have a little hoop again.
One of them.
Screaming. Yeah, well, and I think this one, I watched a lot of the because I was trying to find an intro video for this one. And so I watched a lot of videos about the play before I watched the play. And so having it situated with Robin Hood, I was like, oh, I know who King John is. And it made it all relevant to me. And even though that means I have to admit, to this, my only experiences with the Disney film, still, it made it relevant, and I was able to understand what was going on. It's like, okay, I know who King Richard is. I know who King John is. This particular situation obviously isn't in that movie, but that character of King John being the worst,
Yes.
that was familiar to me. And King Richard being up on this pedestal, that was familiar to me. And so kind of seeing that play out too was interesting. So one of the things that the two actors talked about was that the guy who played King John decided to play him as a sociopath. So if you haven't seen this version, it's really interesting because he just goes from this, he plays that really well. I felt like he just seemed a little crazy because he said, I was thinking about how could this guy make these weird decisions the way he did, and the only thing that made sense is if he was a sociopath. And so that's how he played it.
Well, and I think that's
now I'm excited.
Go ahead.
Now I'm excited to go watch it.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why it made the play is kind of difficult for especially maybe troops that aren't as consummate professionals as Stratford is that there isn't a whole lot of psychological depth provided in the plays. People do the things they do, and the story goes on, but there's no real sort of explanation as to why the choices that are made. And it can be difficult if you can't understand your character to play that character. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting choice. This guy must be a sociopath. He must be making choices in a way that normal people just wouldn't do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because there was a scene in the play because the king orders Arthur killed, and then the guy who he ordered to kill him, comes back to the king and says, well, I've done it, but he hadn't really. But the king says, why would you do that? I never told you to. You misunderstood me. And he pulls out the paper. It's right here with your seal. And the king, steals it from him and hides it. And it's just kind of a funny scene. But it's that kind of idea of what's going on? How are these decisions being made? Which Shakespeare contemplates that a lot, right? Life, and is it divine? Like, is it an appointment? Is it fate? Or do we have a choice? And all of those kinds of things kind of come into play. And there's a lot of that, like, are these events just random? Are these things happening because they're random? Because it doesn't really make sense. They go to war, and then they turn against this town, and then half of the barons leave and fight for France for a little while, and then the king of France is going to kill them, and it's just this back and forth that it really doesn't make sense. It's just these two kings like trying to get what they want and doing what's best for them is kind of how it's portrayed, which wouldn't be very complimentary, I think, to anybody in royalty, but it was interesting to see that in the play.
That's really interesting as far as the political ramifications of that, connecting it to who was king or queen when it was written, though. Because we were talking earlier about how these plays were used somewhat as propaganda for not just policing the reigning monarch, but also to legitimize their reign. So that's an interesting insight. I'm going to have to keep that in mind when I watch it.
Yeah, because it was interesting to me because there's definitely that in there, who has the legitimate right to rule. But it's when the bastard comes in at the beginning, he's appealing to King John to say, because there's this dispute, right? The younger brother is saying, well, hey, you're not legitimate, so I get all of my father's stuff. And he said when he was dying, he wanted me to have it. So it was his will, and it's my right because I'm the legitimate son. So there's that issue. And then we have King John, who was not legitimate by either one of those, from my understanding, because they're saying Arthur was the legitimate successor because his father was Gregory. Yes, Gregory, who was the second son. So Richard died, and then Gregory died, and so Arthur should have taken the place, I guess, is what they're saying. But then what's interesting is the bastard was Richard's son, and so then wouldn't he be the first king's son? So he gives up his dad that he thought was his dad his whole life. He gives up that inheritance so that he can have a title, and now he's Sir Richard is what they call him now. And it's interesting to see all of these things.
So, okay, so I have a question. I don't know if somebody could look it up really quick. Which one of those individuals will tie into the reigning monarch and possibly legitimize either James or Elizabeth? Because I would almost bet whoever was on top in that was in the lineage of the king or queen that was. I have very little internet, so I'm afraid to even go on Google and look to see when it was written and who
I can
the
find
king or queen was, if it was during James or if it was Elizabeth.
I'm looking it up right now. It says it was written in the mid 1590s, but it wasn't published for another like 30 years.
But it would be the playing date that would matter when it was performed.
1590 or sometime in that decade.
Right. So who was, see, I'm not finding who was the, but it would be interesting to see that. But definitely in here, the character Richard's son is the one who has the most lines and who comes across as the sane one, the one who's really who really has honor and integrity in ruling, where King John comes across as crazy.
Elizabeth was queen in 1590. She crossed over into the early 1600s and then died early.
So you related? Okay. She'd been I mean, I guess they were all related though. They were all still the same house, weren't they? How did that?
Well, then you got to get into. And when
we're all brothers and
nephews. She was the daughter of Henry VIII.
Say that again, Kathleen. You kind of cut out.
She was the daughter of Henry VIII. So I would. You may lose me. I would take that back and see if Richard or who ended up on top at the end of that play, John or Richard?
Well, I think sort of John, but not really, because like he's kind of lost it at the end. I feel like it kind of devolved at the end, but I think the end, because what I was looking up, one of the things that the pre-shows that I watched talked about the Magna Carta, and that was the barons, I think, that deserted King John and then came back, but it was King John's son, Henry III, who ruled after him. So, but then the next play that Shakespeare wrote was Richard II, and I'm not sure where, I was actually trying to look that up, where he fell in the line.
Richard II?
In the lineage.
Well, by that, you've got the Yorks and the Lancasters. This is the War of the Roses. And which, by the way, is the inspiration for Game of Thrones, where you have Lannisters instead of Lancasters and Starks instead of Yorks. It's not that far from the original. And the War of the Roses ends with Henry VII marrying Margaret. I'm not sure how she's distinguished from all the other Margarets and Elizabeths and stuff, but but combining those two families.
Okay.
And that's how, sort of it resolves that split in the family. And of course, Henry VII is the grandfather of Elizabeth.
Right.
So that's interesting because I mean, my knowledge of this period of time is limited to what I learned in Shakespeare, what I learned in Restoration Comedy last year. So I need to keep taking these classes because I'm learning more by doing that. So because Mary, 100 years later, right, or not quite 100 years later, she married a guy from Denmark.
Which Mary?
You talking about the one where the only two that ruled together that was queen and king at the
William
same
Mary.
Yes, William. Yeah, so that brought together two different kingdoms, right? Somehow. Because there's a
that
single
was
I'm not very articulate tonight. I'm sorry.
I mean, that was more they wanted a Protestant.
Right. Protestant
king.
versus Catholic, yes. So they kicked out Mary's dad, James.
Right, right.
And so, but then it was because of Mary, and that put some restrictions on theater because Charles, right, had been very, the one who opened theater up was very loose with morals and things like that. And so then Mary and William came in and were the morality police again. I know we're a little bit ahead of Shakespeare, but it's interesting to me to see how all these people are connected.
Well, and of course, this would have been much more familiar to the audience.
Right. They would have known. So I'm looking up. I've got the whole lineage, but so what house? Okay, so this was something that I couldn't figure out because the whole play they kept saying the
Plantagenet.
I was like, what is Plantagenet? I just found it. It's one of the houses.
Yes.
Now it all makes sense because they kept calling him the bastard. They kept calling him that. And so what does that say about what they're saying about who's legitimate and who's not? Does that say something?
Well, it's another one of the houses, just like Tudor or, it's sort of they're sort of clumped together into dynasties almost, right? And it's the house of or the house of, and the Plantagenets. I used to know a lot more of this than I do now. I read a whole lot of historical fiction that was set during the Plantagenet dynasties, but I mean, they're all part of the sort of lineage of the kings of England. But it gets complicated if you don't have, the first son succeeding the first son succeeding the first son, then you start to get arguments, right? And fights, competing claims for the throne. And of course, this is exactly what Shakespeare's writing about in King John, right? So, and anyone who's a member of a kingdom like that knows how important it is, not just for the families that are the ruling families and who gets to be king and who doesn't, but picking the wrong side can be deadly if you end up being seen as a traitor or fighting on the wrong side, right? Being in the wrong army.
So that was something that was interesting. It kind of leads to a different, what you just said kind of leads me to a different question, which we don't have a whole lot of time to cover, but the women in this play are interesting because we have King John's mother, and then we have Arthur's mother, and then we have Blanche, who's a niece to King John. And so we have King John's mother directing him to go to war against Arthur. We have Arthur's mother trying to get the King of France to come on her side and advance Arthur's cause. And then we have the church who tries to create peace. I think it was the church who did this by saying, or it was the people of the town actually who said, well, if you just have this person marry this person, then we'll all be happy.
Right.
And so Blanche gets caught in the middle, and there's a really great scene where she's like being torn in two directions, saying, well, you're my uncle, but you're my husband, and now where am I supposed to do? So that was really an interesting moment in the play that kind of captures that, like, who do I support? And she was in the middle because of that marriage.
Well, in the production I saw, John really played up the roles of women. There are some really strong female roles in this play. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's kind of surprising this play isn't more popular, because it does really give, unlike some other Shakespearean plays, that don't have a lot of like really juicy female parts. We talked about Timon of Athens being a good example of that. But this play does, and some of these women are shown as being sort of the power behind the throne. In the production I saw of King John, the title character isn't being played as a sociopath. In fact, he's kind of weak and is just sort of like, oh, I should do this. Oh, I should do this. So I don't, like he didn't know what he should do. He wasn't a leader.
Right.
And the women in his family were right there behind him, sort of directing him.
Yeah. Well, and we get that a little bit in this version. We have the sociopath King John like crying on the floor because his mom's gone. Kind of like in the cartoon Robin Hood, where he's sucking on his thumb and crying for his mommy. It was kind of like a real flashback to that for me. But you're right. And what was interesting, because the queen was, both of them were saying, we're going to battle. I'm leading the army to war. And
right.
That surprised me that it wasn't the king saying, I'm going to lead the army to war. It was his mother saying, I'm leading the army to war. And they're on the battlefield with the armies, which is interesting.
Okay, so I have an interesting thought. Remember, I told you that I saw Richard III last year in Tucson. And what impressed me from that production was also the strong female characters in that one. Could it be that he wrote the strong female characters in the histories in order to impress his female patron, the queen?
I don't think there's any question. Absolutely. Elizabeth was such Elizabeth was such her father's daughter, right? And Henry VIII, his quest was to produce a son, right? So he could create a dynasty. He could continue this dynasty. And, it's hard to know so many years later, but there's so much evidence that he really did love his first wife. They had a happy marriage, but he was so desperate for a son that he was willing to blow that up. And of course, never really worked out very well for him. And he couldn't recognize that he had produced a very worthy, strong leader for England because it was a girl, right? Though, going back to Shakespeare's histories, last summer I saw another rarely produced history, Henry VIII, which is nothing but propaganda for Elizabeth. At the end of the play, Henry is holding up this baby and Elizabeth Regina is going to be the greatest leader that England had ever seen. Like Henry said anything like that when he heard he'd had a second girl, right? Anne lost her head because of it. But yeah, Shakespeare knew that he was writing for a great queen who made herself into a she created this role of a female monarch, which had never really been seen before, and refused to get married, called herself a prince. She was a prince in a woman's body. So yeah, he knew that she would be very favorably influenced by strong female characters.
Well, and it makes sense if we go back to that legitimacy, that if he can show, by showing that King John way back when was ruled by his mother and these women were calling shots back then, it kind of lends to that. Well, women have been ruling for a long time. They just didn't have the title or whatever.
Well, and Eleanor of Aquitaine is a great queen, of history. And really was probably the power behind the throne. So evoking that in this play, having Queen Elizabeth being the power behind the throne, really being the one that's making decisions, even though John, has the crown, has the title, was certainly going to resonate with Elizabeth. And Shakespeare would have known that, surely.
Yeah, well, and it makes sense because at the very end of the play, Eleanor dies, and then it's just kind of Prince John just kind of fizzles out after that. So very interesting, that connection. Well, it's 7:34. So we did it. We talked about King John for 45 minutes. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Next week, we're talking about Pericles, which is another one that I haven't ever read or seen. So that should be interesting. I'm getting a lot of experience with Shakespeare this summer. So I hope you guys will join us next week too. Suki, maybe you'll be here. I think Alyssa Abbott is going to be here. We'll see. But I think that's who's going to be here. So Kathleen, if you want to come next week too, you can.
I will watch in advance this time. How's that?
Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Have a good week.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.